we were doing a bunch of podcasts, me and George, and I was there, with George, and I was just struck by so many of the questions that they were asking him, and something very important came to mind. And I was listening to George defending himself against certain critiques. Some people were asking, the commentators were asking, bringing up certain critiques against George, and one of them was that he was scared to fight. And I was thinking to myself, that's just such a crazy allegation. This guy has been literally fighting professionally since he's 19 years old. And now he's at the age of 37. He's been fighting from the age of 19, and he's fought the who's who. He's fought the who's who in the welterweight division. And now today, at the age of 37, they're asking him, hey, why aren't you fighting again? Is it because you're scared? People are saying that you are scared to get in the octagon or the cage. Now, I found that so preposterous, so absurd, but I felt two things really struck me. Okay, the first thing that struck me when I heard that question was, number one was, as good as George is, as good as he is, he still has to validate himself. He still has to keep telling people, convincing people that he's good. And I find that really, it kind of struck me, because I was sitting there watching him trying to defend himself, and I was thinking, I can't believe that these questions are the questions. Now, it wasn't the host. I don't want to blame the host. The hosts were just echoing what certain people in the public sphere were saying. And they were asking George to address these claims, that one, he's scared, or two, he's avoiding people or whatnot, and that maybe he doesn't think he's good. He's not good enough. He's not good enough to rise to the challenge. Now, I'm thinking to myself, this is crazy. And I kind of, I always get messages from you guys. I get emails every day. I get so many emails every day for people asking me questions or advice and stuff like that. And one thing people always ask me is confidence and overcoming mental difficulties, etc. And I find myself, very, very amazed that even the top 1%, even the top most talented or successful people still also have to defend themselves all the time. All the time. They always have to defend themselves. They always have to compare themselves to others. And I was sitting there listening to George, and I was like, man, this is exactly what I always get asked about. This is exactly what people are always asking me about in emails or whatnot. And this happening to George right here before my eyes. George St. Pierre, arguably the greatest martial artist in history, is here defending himself, trying to convince these guys that these allegations or these criticisms of him are unfounded. And I was thinking to myself, how much better would you have to be? How good would you have to be so that nobody will criticize you? And the answer to that, I think, is it's impossible. It's impossible to ever get rid of all your critics. Now, I find myself sometimes getting bullied online. Some people are sending me, I get some negative messages. I'm happy to say that I don't get many, but I do get, and I'm also wondering to myself how crazy it is now to look at George and see him have to sit there and tell these guys, no, it's not because he's scared, but it's because he's had enough. And the man is 37 years old. He has been fighting. His last fight, he was 37 or 36. He has been fighting since the age of 19 professionally. And in his prime years of competition, he fought the who's who. I think he has the record for most title defenses, or he's tied for most title defenses or championship bouts, or I think he's got one of those records. And every one of those fights was scary. Every one of those fights was superbly risky. And he's sitting there now, nearing 40, and he still has to defend himself and convince people that he's not scared, or that he's good enough, or that he's a good fighter or whatnot. I just find that so preposterous, and I kind of I follow the comments on my breakdowns. And when I did the post-fight analysis of Khabib and McGregor, so many people were stepping on McGregor, saying that he's exposed, that he's no good or whatnot. And I find that crazy, because the man, if you think about it, okay, McGregor's a brilliant fighter. He's one of the greatest fighters to ever do it. He's one of the greatest fighters to ever step into the octagon. No doubt about it. There's no question that he is one of the best ever. And the fact that he lost one fight, or that he lost two fights, or they lost 3 fights doesn't remove that at all. The fact that Jose Aldo lost to McGregor doesn't make Jose Aldo the lesser of the 2 fighters. Now, Jose Aldo may be past his prime, and McGregor came up, and we have Aldo going down and a McGregor going up in his prime, and he loses. But McGregor did not do what Aldo did in the featherweight division. I still consider Aldo to be the greatest featherweight of all time. He's still, in my opinion, the greatest featherweight of all time. Now, when McGregor lost, of course, there's a lot of backlash because he's a talker, and when you have that kind of talk, when you're the type of person that talks a lot, the second you lose, don't be surprised if people jump on you. I get that totally, but there's some people that think he got exposed, that he always was no good, that he's always been overrated, and actually he's very easy to beat, and that Khabib finally exposed him. And I find that so absurd. Those people who talk like that, in my opinion, really don't know anything about fighting. They really don't know anything about fighting. There are literally thousands of people trying to get into UFC. There are literally thousands of people at 155 trying to break their way in UFC. Now, UFC only has 500 fighters. In the lightweight division, I'm not sure how many there is, but let's call it 100. Okay, let's say, because that's a very popular division. Lightweight and welterweight are probably the 2 most populated divisions. Let's call it 100. There's only 100 guys. And from those 100 guys, of course, only 5 are in the top 5, but only, if you think about all the lightweights there is in the world, not even 1% make it to the top 5. Not even 1%. It's not even 1% of all the guys who are aspiring to make it in the top 5 in UFC. It's got to be in the thousands. It's got to be. I mean, there are guys all over the world competing in regional shows, national shows. They are all trying to fight their way in UFC. And if you think about it, I'm talking about from amateur to pro at every level. There are thousands and thousands of people fighting at 155 trying to get in UFC. And then you have the guy in the top 5. I would say, McGregor's are no doubt in the top 5 at 155. Being criticized that he's absolutely no good, that he's been exposed, that he's a bum, etc. And I felt like a lot of this was happening to George over a little trip, because George now he's taking a hiatus, hasn't fought in a year, he had colitis, he's overcome these things, and people were still asking him these questions, and I was kind of surprised in a way. I thought that he was well received. Of course, he was well received, but once asked certain questions, I was shocked to hear this one question. And it just brings to mind that a lot of people don't know anything about fighting. I remember once upon a time, George was in the Guinness Book of World Records for most time spent in the octagon. I have that actual book, the year. I think it was surpassed after by Frankie Edgar. But there was a time and place where George St. Pierre had logged in the most hours in the octagon. And I remember sitting there and just being amazed how my good friend and arguably the greatest martial artist of all time had to defend himself, try to tell guys, hey, he's still good enough. Total shocker for me.